Since July 8, Israel has been engaged in a brutal offensive against Gaza, dubbed Operation Protective Edge. But the country's bombing campaign and subsequent invasion of Gaza has reached a tipping point. With scores of civilians dying every day, the media is no longer able to ignore the bloodshed. At least 690 Palestinians have been killed at the time of this broadcast, and over 4,500 left injured, according to the Middle East Eye. At least 161 of the dead are children. That's one child being killed every hour in Gaza, according to the UN. Now, on the Israeli side, 3 civilians and 32 IDF soldiers have died during the latest siege. According to Palestinian health officials, Israel's military has targeted mosques, schools, and more than 25 health facilities, including elderly care units and hospitals. So far, over 100,000 Palestinians have been displaced from the violence. As horrifying as these developments are, this is a tragic tale that's all too familiar. Here in the West, we're taught that Israel is a country surrounded by terrorists who want to destroy it, and that a constant barrage of rocket fire threatens its way of life, which gives Israel the right to defend itself over and over again. A defense that facilitates more than $3 billion a year in military aid from U.S. taxpayers, more than any other country receives in support. So given the overwhelming amount of U.S. support for one side of the conflict, what are its roots? And who is the true instigator of violence? To break it all down, I'm joined by Alison Weir, author of Against Our Better Judgment, the hidden history of how the U.S. was used to create Israel, and founder of If Americans Knew. Thanks so much for coming on, Alison.
Thank you for having me.
So, Alison, for the last decade, the media has been saying any violence is justified by Israel's right to defend itself from rocket fire going back all the way to 2001. Debunk the talking point that all of this started with Hamas rockets.
Yes, it's very easy to debunk that. The media just sort of doesn't bother to look at the actual facts for some reason. The fact is that the first rocket from Gaza was launched in April of 2001. In 2001, a total of 4 rockets were launched from Gaza. I was in Gaza before that, in February and March of 2001, before any of these rockets had been launched. And I personally saw, and many other people did too, that Israeli forces were shelling Gaza at that time nightly. They were also shelling parts of the West Bank. In Gaza, I would go through some residential neighborhoods, and especially in southern Gaza, that were completely bullet-riddled by Israeli mortar fire, rocket fire. They were using F-16s at that time already, helicopter gunships. I saw large residential homes full of families that were in ruins in February and March of 2001. Already that year, I believe Israeli forces had killed about 35 Palestinian children before any of the rocket launches started. So obviously there was a great deal of violence coming from Israeli forces. That preceded the rockets. It's also...
Yeah, sure, go on.
Well, I was going to mention the other thing that the media says, which is of course following the Israeli talking point, is that it is because of Hamas that Israel is engaging in one assault after another on Gaza. But Hamas was elected in 2006, and we already saw a number of invasions of Gaza, many people killed long before Hamas was elected.
According to your organization, Alison, Israel currently has 262 Jewish-only settlements built on confiscated Palestinian land and have demolished over 28,000 Palestinian homes. Let's take a look at that famous map showing Palestinian land loss since 1946 through the year 2000. I don't know if we have that map showing those 4 subsequent states. Under what legal pretense is this being justified?
Well, it's really not legal. This is against Geneva Conventions. You cannot acquire land through conquest, but Israel continues to do this. It's important for Americans to realize that Israel has never declared its borders. We are consistently told it's the only democracy in the Middle East, and yet it has not declared its borders because it has from the beginning had a plan to expand those borders, and it has done so. And in addition, it's never written a constitution. There isn't a constitution, so it can change its basic laws whenever it wishes to, and it does that.
And Israel says that they pulled out their troops from Gaza years ago. But Alison, as someone who's been there extensively, who's studied the area very extensively, talk about how the population is still being controlled in the occupied territories, how the border is still regulated in a way that blocks essential staples from reaching the people.
Yes, Gaza is basically, many people call it quite accurately, a large open-air prison. Israel controls the borders. It's very difficult to get into Gaza and to get out of Gaza because Israel and Egypt, which controls the southern border and does very much what the U.S. and Israel wanted to do, makes it often impossible to leave Gaza and to get into Gaza. It's very difficult. So after the massacre that occurred a few years ago, in which about 1,400 Palestinians in Gaza, men, women, and many, many, many children were killed. Their homes, huge parts of Gaza were destroyed. I saw that too. Going in a year later, very little had been rebuilt because Israel was preventing building materials from going into Gaza. So people were still living in tents. Schools had not been rebuilt. Many hospitals had not been rebuilt, clinics. I talked to an Israeli, a Palestinian physician who explained to me operating rooms were undersupplied. They often didn't have anesthesia that's necessary for just simple standard operations. They didn't have X-ray film to use for X-rays. There were very significant medicines and medications, life-saving ones, that were insufficiently available in Gaza itself. There were a great many of small children who were suffering different types of diseases, easily treated ones, some of them causing excruciating pain for toddlers, for example, who then were not being allowed to leave Gaza to go for medical care. Gaza has been under a siege since Hamas was elected in 2006. But truthfully, before that, when I was there in a few years before that, it was also very difficult to get into and out of Gaza, even again, before Hamas was elected.
Right, so we have all the borders closed, even chocolate, pasta, anesthetics. I don't see how any of those things could be justified to not be allowed in Gaza. None of those things could be made into weapons, Alison. You talked about before 2006. Let's go back all the way to the beginning. You wrote a book called Against Our Better Judgment, which talks about the hidden history about how Israel was created and why it was formed. What role did the U.S. play in its creation, Alison?
Well, in researching my book, I was astounded to learn that the movement to create Israel, called political Zionism, has existed in the United States since the late 1800s. And I grew up here, and I had never even heard of that movement, but it's a very significant one. U.S. officials in the State Department and the Pentagon and our intelligence agencies were actually opposed to supporting Zionism. Zionism was the intention of creating a Jewish state in Palestine, land that was already inhabited by a population that in the early 1900s was approximately 80% non-Jewish. I think it was. No, actually it was 95% at that point that was non-Jewish. So the idea was to dispossess that population and create a Jewish state on that land. There were major manipulations in the United States to push the Zionist agenda. I was astounded. There are a great many books that have documented that, just most people don't know about them because most of them are out of print. But there was major activism on behalf of Zionism. Some of it was very public. Much of it was kept hidden. There were a number of front groups for the groups that were in Palestine at that time, working to fight against the Palestinians who were living on that land. So it was, if people want to know, well, where did this violence in Gaza start? Do you go back to July 12th or maybe June 8th when the 3 Israelis were abducted? You learned that just before they were abducted, 4 Palestinian children had been killed. You learned that from the beginning of 2014, January 1st, there had been already 30 Palestinians killed before those 3 were abducted. So where do you start? Where do you go back? Mm-hmm. Well, to understand the beginning, you go back to the creation of Israel, which occurred with a war of conquest in 1947 to 1949, in which approximately 750,000 people were pushed out to make way for a Jewish state. The Palestinian role in this, their original crime, was simply being on land that someone else wanted.
And all we hear today is that Hamas is this terrorist organization that's constantly using human shields and that they rejected this ceasefire. Alison, I mean, how did Hamas come to be, and why did the Palestinian Authority and Fatah fail in Gaza in gaining support?
Well, Gaza and the West Bank, both, it's important to remember that they're very much under the control of Israel. The governments within those two entities are there largely because Israel allows them to function to a degree. I mean, Israel controls the borders. We're talking about governments basically within prisons. So they have very limited power. Now Gaza, but there was a fair election in which Hamas won the election. Under Fatah, which was the main Palestinian Authority, things had gotten worse. Israel had taken more Palestinian land. It had created more suffering for Palestinians. The Palestinian Authority had been unable to stop that. So here we have Hamas, a chance to change parties. That's usually considered a very positive thing for a democracy, to see that there is a sharing of power, that a different party can be elected. It was portrayed accurately at that time as not corrupt, that it would fight for the rights of Palestinians and try to prevent the continued confiscation of their land. So there was an election held. By all accounts, it was a fair election. Hamas was elected. Israel did not want that, so immediately Gaza in particular came under a great deal of pressure, especially economic pressure. Hamas was demonized, although it had won an election. There are resistance forces in the Palestinian territories that are armed, but Hamas was also a political party. It had done a great deal of, it had organized clinics, schools, etc.
Which, of course, then makes all of those fair game, I guess, for bombing targets. We have about 20 seconds left, Alison. Obviously, a two-state solution. It doesn't look like it's on the table. What can people do to help stop this violence, Alison? We have about 15 seconds.
Israel's power comes from the United States. It's our over $8 million per day. Really now it's moving up to about $10 million per day coming from the United States and the diplomatic shielding. Once more Americans start letting their elected officials know that we do not want our money used this way, that we do want peace in the Middle East,
absolutely,
and that funding Israel prevents it.
Thank you.
That's the only thing I think.
Thank you so much. We do need to stand up and demand that to be end. Alison Weir, author, founder of If Americans Knew. Appreciate it. Podcast, and over 4,500 left injured, according to the Middle East Eye. At least 161 of the dead are children. That's one child being killed every hour in Gaza, according to the UN. Now, on the Israeli side, 3 civilians and 32 IDF soldiers have died during the latest siege, according to Palace support. So given the overwhelming amount of U.S. support for one side of the conflict, what are its roots? And who is the true instigator of violence? To break it all down, I'm joined by Alison Weir, author of Against Our Better Judgment, the hidden history of how the U.S. was used to create Israel, and founder of If Americans Knew. Thanks so much for coming on, Alison. In health officials, Israel's military has targeted mosques, schools, and more than 25 health facilities, including elderly care units and hospitals. So far, over 100,000 Palestinians have been displaced from the violence. As horrifying as these developments are, this is a tragic tale that's all too familiar. Here in the West, we're taught that Israel is a country surrounded by terrorists who want to destroy it, and that a constant barrage of rocket fire threatens its way of life, which gives Israel the right to defend itself over and over again. A defense that facilitates more than $3 billion a year in military aid from U.S. taxpayers, more than any other country receives. And since July 8, Israel has been engaged in a brutal offensive against Gaza, dubbed Operation Protective Edge. But the country's bombing campaign and subsequent invasion of Gaza has reached a tipping point. With scores of civilians dying every day, the media is no longer able to ignore the bloodshed. At least 690 Palestinians have been killed at the time of this broadcast.